Hi class, this is our video lecture on the technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. In this lecture you're going to learn about the inventions and inventors that fueled the Industrial Revolution in the United States. By the end of this lecture you need to be able to explain the causes, course, and consequences of the 18th century transportation revolution, identify technological improvements, that means inventors and inventions, that contributed to industrial growth. These would include the train, the steamboat, the telegraph, cotton gin, interchangeable parts, textile mills, sewing machines, steel plows, mechanical reapers, and industrial lubrication. So there's a lot of matching in this one. So let's talk about what the Industrial Revolution is. The simplest way to define it, it's a period of rapid growth in using machines in manufacturing, agriculture, and transportation. It really begins in the mid-1700s in Europe, principally in Britain, and by the 1800s it starts to arrive in the United States. And it really starts in Britain because Britain at that time had large deposits of energy, coal, that were very close to the surface that they could use to power steam engines. They also had a very large workforce there. Agriculture was becoming less prominent because they're growing a lot of their food in other places, and a lot of those people needed work, so they end up working in factories that are fueled by all these coal-powered steam engines. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, the old way of manufacturing things usually involved people making things at home or getting it made by a local craftsperson like a blacksmith. This was very time-consuming and expensive. The other drawback is no two items are exactly alike. Everything is basically custom made to order. Makes it very hard to replace or repair things because they have to be made over again from scratch pretty much. The new way of manufacturing is mass production, and this is what takes hold during the Industrial Revolution. There's a couple innovations that allow mass production to happen. First is the development of interchangeable parts, and this comes from a guy named Eli Whitney that we're going to talk about a couple times in this lecture. Now, Eli Whitney, during the American Revolution, he was trying to make himself some money, and he made a contract with the government in order to build rifles. And rifles before that time were made by individual gunsmiths. Every one was a little bit unique. And if something broke on it, usually the gunsmith had to make new parts from scratch. Eli Whitney had made this commitment to supply a huge amount of rifles very quickly, and he came up with the idea of having different craftspeople build specific parts, and making all those parts the same way, so that the assembly could happen very quickly, and also any broken parts could be replaced by stock parts because they were all the same. Next innovation would be machine tools, and this is the idea of using a machine to do a simple job so that there's no human error in the assembly. The machine is going to do the same action the same way as long as it's functioning okay every single time, whereas a human could get tired, they could be not paying attention, they could make mistakes. The third development is division of labor, and this is the idea that individual workers focus on one specific task of the production of the product instead of producing the whole item. You see this a lot of times if you've ever watched video footage of assembly lines today, where one worker will have one specific task that they do over and over and over again. The benefit of this is the person usually gets very fast at doing that one task, and they make less mistakes. This development in mass production, its big effect is it's going to make many more products available at a much lower price. So many of the people who are working in these factories and starting to make wages, they can start to afford the products that are being produced in the factories because they're available at such a low price, as opposed to the old system where things were made one at a time and they were very expensive. The Industrial Revolution is really going to start in America in the textile industries. Textile is fabric. It's basically the finished fabric that's used to make into clothing, things like that. Now, textile mills was the big business in Britain in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And the technology that they used in their machines in the textile mills was very closely guarded secret. one of the Brits, named Samuel Slater, is going to realize if he can take this technology to the United States, that he can be on the ground floor of this industry and grow it and make himself a lot of money. And this is a very smart guy, but he knows he can't bring plans out of Britain, so he actually memorizes the designs of all of these machines and stores it away in his head, moves to the United States, gets some financial backing, and starts building textile mills and starts making lots and lots of money. The textile mills were mainly built in the Northeast and in New England. They used initially the power of the rivers to operate the machines, and then later on they switched to steam power that's more reliable and stronger. And cotton from the southern states would be shipped to New England and then made into fabric and clothing, and then could be resold there or shipped back to the south or shipped overseas. Another development in clothing manufacturing was the creation of the sewing machine, and this was invented by a couple of guys, Elias Howe and Isaac Singer. The sewing machine made production of clothes faster, more reliable, and it also made it easier to repair clothing. So with these changes in manufacturing, we see a lot of effects on the United States. These are just some of the effects. Many job seekers who lived in rural communities and they worked on farms, they're going to move from those farms into the city. They're going to seek work and wages. And you see this not just with men, but also even with women and whole families. It's going to cause the cities to explode in size as all these new workers move in from the countryside, and also as immigrants move in from other countries. These cities are going to grow very rapidly. Initially, the working conditions in these factories are very poor, and it's going to result in a lot of reform movements to try and improve conditions for workers, wages. Pollution is also going to be a major problem. With all these steam engines operating, the cities themselves are going to be very dirty and polluted, along with the air. You're going to see employment of not just men, but also women and children. There were certain mills that we're going to learn about in our next unit that employed predominantly young single women. There were other sets of mills that usually hired whole families. So you see a lot of child labor during this time, which is also going to be the subject of a lot of the reform movements. Because you have all these people that are working in factories and earning wages, you see the rise of a middle class of people in the United States. Not subsistence farmers, but not necessarily wealthy people, that really start to form the bulk of the population in these cities. And we start to see lots of people starting to purchase factory-made items instead of making them at home. So they rely on their wages to acquire things and not necessarily spend lots of time at home making their own clothing and things like that. It really ends up resulting in people just having a lot more stuff than they used to have. Before the Industrial Revolution, your average person might have had 1-2 sets of clothes. They would have lived in a small house that probably had 1 to 2 rooms. Furniture would be shared. It would never be replaced. Maybe new furniture might be built at home. Now you're going to see people moving into bigger homes. They're going to have more clothes. They're going to have more stuff in their houses. We really see that really start to take hold with the Industrial Revolution. This is your first practice. You've got 4 true-false statements. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to, look at your notes, and mark these true or false. We also see a lot of changes in transportation during the Industrial Revolution. These changes really lead to a rapid growth in both the speed and convenience of travel. It was normal before the Industrial Revolution. People rarely traveled more than walking distance from where their home was. With the Industrial Revolution and all the innovations, you're going to see people traveling all over the country, which rarely ever happened before then. One of the first big innovations is the steamboat, which is developed by Robert Fulton. These were boats that could move upriver. They could move against the current of the river. They no longer needed wind power to move them. It's going to drastically lower transportation costs. The United States had lots of rivers that it could use, so steamboats provided sort of a highway throughout the country. This growth in river traffic is going to lead to disputes between states, because often states share a river. Either the river forms the border of the 2 states, or the river is really long and it passes through multiple states. the Supreme Court is going to step in, and it's going to issue the Gibbons v. Ogden ruling that's going to say that the federal government has the power to regulate the trade in between states. And that really eliminated a lot of the disputes, because then the federal government can settle on who's allowed to use the river, who's not, that kind of thing. We also see the development of railroads during this time. The first American to really promote the use of railroads was a guy named Peter Cooper, and he's going to invent a little train called Tom Thumb. That's a drawing of what Tom Thumb looked like. In order to try and promote his train, he arranged kind of a showcase where he was going to have his train pulling a load of people race against a horse and buggy. And he was actually winning the race until his train broke down, and then the horse ended up winning. But the train is still going to take hold in the United States, and the United States is going to embrace the train even faster than Europe did. In 1840, there's about 2,800 miles of railroad track in the United States, which at that time was more than existed all throughout Europe. By 1860, there are 30,000 miles of railroads in the United States, and virtually connected every major city in the United States. Railroads themselves, the companies, become the most powerful businesses in the nation. Sometimes the owners of these railroad companies, they were known as the robber barons of the time, because they were making so much money. And you can see on this chart this rapid growth of rail usage. Now, if we want to look at these railroads, so often these railroad companies could become so rich and powerful because they got a lot of assistance from the federal government in the form of land grants. I've got here, this is a map of Nebraska, and I want to give you an idea of how much land these railroad companies were often given in order to build railroads from point to point. So this is a map of Nebraska, and you can kind of see the outline of Nebraska and the counties. This giant snake that's going through the middle. The line in the middle of it, that is the rail line. All the green space that you see to either side is the land grants, the land that was given to the railroad by the federal government. And usually they would make an agreement where the railroad company, wherever they built their track, they would get all the land for 5 or 10 or 20 miles to either side of the track. They would get the title to that land, and they would own that land. And then the railroad company would also own anything that was on that land. If they discovered gold on that land, they owned that. If they found coal deposits, they would own that. The railroad companies would then sell the land, often very cheap, to settlers who would move west and live on that land. Now the settlers who move onto the land are dependent on the railroad to transport goods for them back and forth. So then the railroad company makes money on any resources on the land. They make money from selling the land. They make money transporting people and goods back and forth to the land. It's a very profitable business, and that's why these rail companies grow to be the most powerful businesses in the country at this time. We're going to look at another inventor who's a little different from some of these other guys, named Elijah McCoy. What makes him different is he was actually the son of some slaves that escaped from Kentucky via the Underground Railroad. We're going to learn about that a little more in the next couple of weeks. But it was a system that was used, kind of a secret network that was used to help slaves escape from the South. His parents had escaped into Canada, which is where he was born. Later on, they moved back to Michigan, and that's where he grows up. He was a very smart, very bright guy. His parents sent him to Scotland when he was 15 so he could train there as a mechanical engineer. When he returns to Michigan, though, he can't find work as an engineer because of the fact that he's black. And even though slavery wasn't legal in Michigan, that doesn't mean there weren't huge racial barriers to anybody who wanted to find employment there. And he was kind of relegated to working as a fireman and oiler on the line for the railroad. He's going to start to identify problems with the railroad and with the trains, and he's going to start inventing things to fix problems with the trains. His first major invention was a system for oiling engine parts, like axles, on trains, and this allowed the trains to run continuously for very long periods of time with less maintenance. It made them much more efficient. He ends up being a very prolific inventor. He received nearly 60 patents over the course of his life for all kinds of things. Ironing boards, train parts, all kinds of stuff. Now, it's not just people and goods that get transported over distances. Information being transported over distances is also very important. And the big innovation in this area was the development of the telegraph by Samuel Morse. This was an electric device that could send information over wires across long distances. Messages were transmitted with the machine in a series of clicking sounds that he developed called Morse code, and different combinations of clicking sounds represented different letters in the alphabet. Now, this wasn't like a modern telephone where you could talk to somebody across the distance and they could hear your voice and understand what you're saying. You know, the message would be tapped away on the telegraph machine like this, and whoever else was on the line further down could hear those clicks and then decipher the message. Often telegraphs were used a lot by railroads, and railroads, when they would build new rail lines, often built telegraph lines to go with the railroads. So the wires often followed the rail lines. And often if people wanted to send a message on a telegraph, they would go to the train station, and then that's where they would dictate the message and have it sent from. People didn't have telegraphs in their home. You know, it wouldn't be something that they could call somebody specifically like a modern phone. It was a basic device from our standards today, but for them it was a great innovation and allowed these messages to be sent virtually instantly over any distance across the country. So let's look at some of the effects of these changes on transportation. We see a great decrease in the cost of transporting both goods and people. Travel also over great distances is also much faster. You see people starting to move a lot more around the United States. It leads to a large increase in construction of things like roads, rails, and canals, and that construction required lots of extra workers, along with the people who are working in the industries and operating the trains and stuff. Here's your second practice. These are true-false. You can pause the video if you need to in order to go through those. We also see changes in agriculture at this time. One of the innovations was the steel plow by John Deere. These are some diagrams of different types of steel plows here. These are from a different company, but you get the same idea. The steel plow had the benefit of being able to plow through thick, rocky soil and not get damaged. It also was designed with a special curve that would turn the soil but prevent the soil from actually sticking to the plow, so it made the plows much more efficient to use in the field. Another innovation was the mechanical reaper by Cyrus McCormick. You see an example over here. Mechanical reaper was an improvement over the old system of harvesting wheat. When wheat was harvested by hand, you'd have the laborers would go out in the field with sickles or scythes, and they would swing it back and forth in order to cut down the wheat, and then other workers would have to come along and bundle up the wheat. This is a machine that would cut the wheat and lay it out so it could easily be bundled. 2 horses and 2 workers could do the same amount of work as dozens of people, and it was much easier work, so it was much more efficient. Another important innovation in agriculture was the cotton gin. Processing cotton was a laborious and time-consuming process. The cotton seeds are kind of buried inside the cotton fibers, and it would typically take one person about 8 hours to remove the seeds from 1 pound of cotton. It just made cotton production not financially viable in the United States. When Eli Whitney invents this cotton gin, and that's the same Eli Whitney with the interchangeable parts, when he invents the cotton gin, what it does is it allows the cotton seeds to be separated from the fibers very quickly. And it basically uses a wire comb. And I've got a couple little videos that show you the wire would be right in here, and then there's a wheel that would have little teeth on it, and it would grip the cotton, and it would pull the cotton through the wire brush. And it's kind of like if you were ever trying to comb really knotty hair with a brush, and you pull it through there, and then what ends up happening is the seeds fall out. And you can see the seeds dropping out on this video. This is a larger cotton gin, and you can see the cotton being fed in here. This is the raw cotton with the seeds in it. This is the wire brush right here that the cotton is being pulled through, and you can see the seeds dropping down into here, and then the finished cotton is dropping into here. What this is going to do is it's going to greatly increase the need for slave labor in the South. And really, in the end of the 1700s, slavery was really starting to die out in the South because it just wasn't a profitable system. Many plantation owners, I'll use George Washington as an example, often had way too many slaves than they could actually find work for, and they were constantly trying to get rid of slaves or sell their slaves because they couldn't afford to feed them all and there wasn't enough work for them. Many of the products that they were growing just didn't require that big of a labor force. Now with the cotton production, these factories exist in the Northeast that want lots and lots of cotton because they can produce lots and lots of textiles and clothes. And the slaves weren't actually used to pick the seeds from the cotton anymore. Now the slaves are going to be used to pick the cotton from the fields, to operate the cotton gins, to pack the cotton, to transport the cotton. So, and by the 1820s, the slave trade has been outlawed. So it's going to increase the demand for these slaves in the South. So with these changes in agriculture, you're going to see great increases in the production of food. And it's this excess output in food production that really makes these very large cities possible. The excess food is all shipped off to the cities where it can be consumed by all these workers that are living in factories. The increase also produces lots of agricultural raw materials that can be used for the factories, like cotton. The machines are labor-saving devices, so they lowered labor demands in the farming and in the fields, which frees up workers that might have worked in agriculture before to move to cities and then work in factories. And our population in the United States starts to become much less rural and a lot more urban, with people, this large migration of people who are moving from the farms of the countryside into the cities to find work. So we got practice number 3. These are more true-false questions. You can pause the video if you need to. And for practice number 4, I want you to try and identify the inventor with each of these. Write the last name of the inventor or inventors, in some cases, of each of the people. And this is going to conclude our video on the technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution in the United States.